Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we begin a long, slow drift across one of the most mysterious and profound periods of human history, the story of the Bronze Age collapse. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a vast, gentle fading of a connected world, leaving behind only the ancient dust of great civilizations. I invite you to share where you're listening from. Let the atmosphere of your own quiet room tone settle softly around us. Settle in now. Find warmth and soften your breath. Allow the weight of the day to lift from your shoulders. Remember, there is nothing to solve, nothing to resist. All the plans and tasks can wait until the morning light. Let my voice be your soft anchor tonight, guiding you into a deep, restful calm. We are drifting back through time towards the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean and the great rivers of the Near East under the deep expanse of the quiet night. Nothing in tonight's story will disturb your peace. Let the gentle greeting settle over you. Now allow yourself a long, slow breath in and out, releasing any lingering tightness. Imagine the air around you is turning soft like mist, plus moonlight, settling over the ancient city of Ugarit. We are entering an ancient myth-like cadence, where the drama of history has been filtered and softened. Time moves slowly here, measured only by the steady, slow tides of the Mediterranean. Our journey begins not with a shout, but with a whisper, tracing the earliest serene visuals of a vast network of kingdoms. We will follow its interconnectedness with a low, gentle hum, ensuring no tension interrupts your drift. If these gentle journeys help you rest, you may leave a soft like or subscribe. Only if it feels comforting and natural for your night. Chapter 1. Origins. The Golden Threads of Bronze. We begin our long narrative at the ultimate origin, the high point of connectivity known as the Late Bronze Age, from 1600 to 1200 BCE. This was the time of immense gentle prosperity and deep interconnection and the ancient background that set the stage for all that followed. The name itself, Bronze Age, is the key to understanding this world. Bronze, a sophisticated alloy of copper and tin, was the indispensable material of the era. It was used for tools, weapons, ritual objects, and statues. But the origins of its components lay in vast, distant geographies. Imagine the necessity. Copper came primarily from places like Cyprus and Anatolia, while tin, the rare, essential hardening agent, came from sources as far away as Afghanistan or Cornwall in Britain, carried slowly, patiently across continents. This inherent geographical separation meant that trade was not just a luxury. It was the origin of civilization itself. Without the continuous, reliable flow of copper and tin, the Bronze Age simply could not exist. The civilizations of this era were linked by a vast, intricate golden thread of commerce and diplomacy. Picture the major powers, the new kingdom of Egypt on the Nile, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mycenaean kingdoms across the Aegean, and the empires of Babylonia and Assyria in Mesopotamia. They existed in a sophisticated, peaceful balance. Their communication was constant and diplomatic, conducted through cuneiform tablets written in the shared language of diplomacy, Akkadian. The tablets, preserved in archives like those at Amarna in Egypt and Hattusa in the Hittite capital, reveal a world of gentle, formal exchange letters between brother kings discussing royal marriages, trade quotas, and mutual defense agreements. This extensive, polite correspondence was the warm breath of the age, ensuring that political stress was managed through careful negotiation. The primary vehicle for this connectivity was the sea trade. The Mediterranean was not a barrier, but a highway. Ships carrying pottery, wine, olive oil, and crucially copper ingots shaped like ox hides sailed along predictable roads. The most famous symbol of this quiet maritime flow is the Uluburun shipwreck sea, 1300 BCE, discovered off the coast of Turkey. Its cargo, a vast, serene collection of goods from at least 8 different cultures, is a profound testament to the seamless globalization of the era. This period is a time of immense stable complexity built on predictable systems of exchange. The foundations of these societies were interlocked. An Egyptian pharaoh needed Hittite silver. A Mycenaean king needed Cypriot copper. A Hittite king needed Egyptian grain. Their dependence on each other was their greatest strength, creating a vast, quiet rhythm of stability across the eastern Mediterranean world. Chapter 2. Formation. The Age of Palace Economies. The quiet foundation of the Bronze Age, built on the steady flow of copper and tin, soon moved into its phase of formation, the creation of sophisticated, highly centralized palace economies. This era saw the emergence of massive organizational structures that dictated the rhythm of daily life and long-distance trade. This formation was characterized by the palace acting as the central nerve center for an entire kingdom, particularly visible in the Mycenaean world of Greece and the Hittite Empire of Anatolia. The palace was not merely the king's residence. It was the hub of economic life. Imagine the palace as a quiet, methodical machine. Within its thick walls, scribes kept meticulous records on small, linear B tablets in the Mycenaean realm, or vast, cuneiform archives in the Near East. These records detailed every aspect of the economy: the collection of taxes in the form of grain, olive oil, and wool, the distribution of rations to workers and artisans, and the allocation of raw materials like bronze for specialized craftsmen. These palaces were centers of profound specialization. Highly skilled artisans worked quietly within the palace walls: bronze smiths, jewelers, potters, and textile workers, all producing high-quality goods that were essential both for internal consumption and for the lucrative export trade. The labor was organized with steady, unhurried precision. The formation of this system brought about a crucial reliance on centralized management. The king and his bureaucracy controlled the entire supply chain, from the moment a copper ingot arrived at the port to the moment a finished bronze spear was distributed. This centralization guaranteed efficiency and quality, but also created a fundamental fragility. If the central management failed, the entire economic structure would seize up. The palace economies fostered the extensive long-distance trade that sustained the age. The Mycenaean palaces, for example, exported vast quantities of perfumed olive oil, wine, and pottery across the Aegean and to the Levant. These goods were exchanged for the vital raw materials like tin and ivory needed to keep the specialized palace workshops operating. The major powers communicated through carefully structured diplomatic gifts, a gentle metaphor for political power. A Hittite king might send a gift of silver to the Egyptian pharaoh, and in return receive exotic goods like gold and fine linens. These exchanges maintained the peaceful balance of power and reinforced the high status of the ruling elite. The warm breath of stability during this phase was entirely dependent on the continuous, smooth function of the palace bureaucracy. The people lived in a predictable rhythm, relying on the central authority for their security, their rations, and the very raw materials that defined the age. This immense interconnected economic dependency was the hallmark of the Bronze Age, making the world feel small, organized, and utterly reliant on its few great centers of power. Chapter 3. Early Journeys. The Network of Diplomacy and Trade. The centralized palace economies had established their internal order, and now they embarked on the immense early journeys that defined the global rhythm of the late Bronze Age. These journeys were characterized by the ceaseless, highly formalized movement of diplomacy, trade, and luxury goods across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The key vehicle for this flow was the state-sponsored correspondence carried across vast distances. Diplomatic envoys traveled continuously bearing letters and gifts between the great kings. These journeys were essential to maintain the balance of power and the continuous supply of vital materials. The letters themselves, often traveling for weeks or months, were a softening filter for political differences, ensuring that disagreements were managed through formal, measured dialogue rather than sudden shifts. Imagine the gentle footsteps of the royal scribes and messengers as they moved between the capitals, from Thebes in Egypt to Hattusa in Anatolia and to the Mycenaean centers of Greece. Their primary cargo was information ensuring that each major power understood the political and military posture of the others. This sustained diplomatic rhythm was the warm breath that prevented minor conflicts from escalating. The second crucial element of these early journeys was the specialized long-distance maritime trade. The sea was the ultimate carrier of the materials that sustained the Bronze Age. The ships, often sailing close to the coast for safety, carried vast amounts of standardized goods, moving with the predictable pattern of the seasons. A primary example is the flow of copper from Cyprus, a strategically important island that served as the primary source for the entire region. Cypriot copper ingots, often marked and standardized, flowed outward to the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. This predictable flow sustained the workshops and armies of all the major powers. The Canaanite city-states along the Levant coast, such as Ugarit and Byblos, were the quiet masters of this maritime exchange. They served as essential anchor ports, providing warehousing, multilingual scribal services, and crucial intermediary roles between the great inland empires, Hittites, Babylonians, and the seafaring Mycenaeans and Cypriots. Ugarit, with its vast library and cosmopolitan culture, was a center where the soft wind carried languages and goods from every corner of the known world. The legacy of these journeys was the creation of a vast shared cosmopolitan culture. Elites across the Mediterranean, whether Mycenaean, Egyptian, or Hittite, shared similar luxury goods, carved ivory specialized pottery, and high-quality gold jewelry. A Mycenaean palace might feature Egyptian scarabs, while a Babylonian court might drink wine from Canaanite jars. This shared material culture was the quiet, visible sign of their deep integration. Their mutual dependence on trade and diplomacy was the source of their immense wealth and stability. However, this tight web of connectivity, while fostering peace and prosperity, also meant that a disruption in one part of the network, a distant echo of stress in one capital, could quickly resonate throughout the entire system. The Bronze Age had truly achieved a form of globalization, making its inherent fragility a universal concern. Chapter 4. Turning Points. Subtle shifts in the supply chain. The tight interdependence of the Bronze Age, sustained by the smooth early journeys of trade and diplomacy, made the world immensely sensitive to any change in the flow of essential materials. This period now entered its first crucial turning point, subtle economic shifts that began to place profound strain on the centralized palace economies. The core of this vulnerability lay ironically in the very material that defined the age bronze, specifically the supply of tin. Tin was always the bottleneck. Copper was relatively abundant, especially from Cyprus, but tin was scarce and had to travel long, complex routes. We view this as a gentle metaphor for global fragility, a civilization dependent on a thread so thin. Any disruption along the tin routes, whether due to political instability in distant sources, changing trade preferences among intermediaries, or even minor geological fluctuations, would quietly but decisively affect every major kingdom. There is evidence suggesting a series of these subtle shifts in the supply chain began to occur around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. The consistent, predictable delivery of tin became less reliable. This was not a sharp cutoff, but a gradual softening filter on the economy. Without reliable tin, the ability to produce high-quality bronze essential for tools, farming implements, and crucially military equipment diminished. Imagine the quiet internal stress within the palace workshops. The scribes who once meticulously recorded the allocation of bronze now had to document shortages. The king's ability to equip his army or fund his building projects with high-quality metal slowly faded. The system of specialization within the palace economies, which relied on the predictable input of raw materials, began to seize up. This economic strain was compounded by changes in the Mediterranean climate. While later historians often interpret this as a natural disaster, we view it as a misty recollection of environmental change a period of long-term drought or shifting weather patterns. This environmental shift subtly affected agricultural yields across the entire region, particularly in Anatolia and the Levant. A series of low harvests meant that the major powers which once exchanged diplomatic gifts now found themselves unable to meet their own internal needs for grain and foodstuffs. The flow of diplomatic letters changed from discussions of royal weddings to increasingly urgent requests for grain shipments, revealing the underlying tension in the food supply. This pressure placed immense strain on the social contract within the palace kingdoms. The king, whose legitimacy rested upon his ability to guarantee the stability of both the economy and the food supply, found his resources diminishing. The large centralized bureaucracy and the system of rations that sustained the artisans and laborers became difficult to maintain. These turning points, in the subtle disruption of the tin trade and the gradual decline in agricultural yield, were not loud or dramatic. They were quiet, relentless forces that acted upon the fundamental formation of the Bronze Age world, pushing its highly centralized, tightly coupled economic structure toward an inevitable slow fracturing. The warm breath of prosperity was becoming cooler, foreshadowing the immense collective changes to come. Chapter 5. Turning Points. The systemic fracture of the palaces. The subtle strains on tin supply and agriculture were not isolated events. They acted as a slow-moving systemic shock to the centralized Bronze Age formation. This period intensified into a crucial set of turning points, the internal social and political fractures that quietly destabilized the palaces. The pressure on the king to guarantee the smooth flow of resources was immense. When the grain reserves dwindled and the bronze supply became intermittent, the king's ability to fulfill his primary duty, to reward loyalty and provision, the populace began to fail. This led to a quiet but profound softening filter on the social contract. Imagine the specialized artisans and laborers who were entirely dependent on the palace for their rations and raw materials suddenly facing uncertainty. Their traditional relationship with the central authority was based on predictability. As that predictability vanished, social cohesion frayed. This pressure caused a subtle internal evolution where groups previously loyal to the palace began to seek survival elsewhere. This internal weakness manifested as a phenomenon known as the Apiru problem. The term Apiru, found in diplomatic letters and administrative texts across the Near East, referred not to a single ethnic group, but to a diverse collection of displaced persons, laborers, former slaves, and even minor nobles who had fallen outside the established palace system. The rise of the Apiru was a gentle metaphor for social dislocation. They were individuals and groups who were no longer anchored to the predictable rhythm of the palace economy, living on the margins and occasionally engaging in low-level raiding or serving as mercenaries for local lords. Their increasing visibility was a quiet sign that the centralized system was failing to contain and manage its own population. The palaces attempted to manage this internal stress through increased rigidity. The diplomatic letters show the kings becoming more desperate, demanding that brother kings return or capture any Apiru found within their borders, revealing the shared escalating anxiety over social order. The reliance on heavily documented centralized control, once the system's greatest strength, now became its weakness, as the reality on the ground dissolved faster than the scribes could document it. Crucially, the external trade network designed for stability acted as a transmitter of this instability. As trade slowed due to resource constraints, the maritime cities along the coast, such as Ugarit, found their primary function diminishing. Their wealth was tied entirely to facilitating the exchange between the great powers. When the great powers could no longer consistently supply or demand goods, the intermediary cities entered a quiet economic decline. This decline was not sudden violence. It was the slow, steady decay of revenue and purpose, weakening the ability of the cities to maintain their defenses or their elaborate administrative systems. The legacy of this period was the slow systemic fracture of trust and political authority. The Bronze Age world was becoming brittle, not from a single external hammer blow, but from the simultaneous erosion of its internal economic and social pillars. The tight web of interdependence, which had fostered such peace, was now dissolving, leaving the entire system vulnerable to the next layer of external pressure. Chapter 6. Turning Points. The quiet movement of peoples. The internal systemic fractures of the palaces caused by economic and environmental stress were the essential prelude to the next profound turning points, the widespread movement of diverse populations across the Mediterranean. This shift was not a single sharp military invasion, but a long, quiet process of demographic displacement and reorganization. This period, roughly corresponding to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, is characterized by the appearance of various groups seeking new settlements. These movements were often referred to in later Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples. We apply our softening filter here, viewing the Sea Peoples not as a unified hostile army, but as a vast, complex, gentle metaphor for refugees, migrants, and displaced persons traveling both by land and by sea, driven by the instability of their collapsing home economies. Imagine the distant echoes of populations abandoning their increasingly brittle palace centers. The disruption of the tin trade, the agricultural shortages, and the internal social unrest meant that vast numbers of people, artisans, laborers, and former palace dependents, were simply no longer anchored to their traditional homes. They took to the sea or the overland routes, seeking regions with greater stability and better resources. Egyptian records, our primary source for this era, speak of groups with names like the Peleset, possibly related to the later Philistines, the Shekelesh, and the Luka. These records show repeated organized attempts by these groups to settle along the coasts of the Levant and the borders of the Egyptian Delta. The Egyptian pharaohs, particularly Ramesses III, documented defensive actions against these migrations. We view these as calm reinterpretations of large-scale border management. The pharaohs successfully repelled these large-scale attempts to settle in the Delta, but the defensive effort was continuous and immensely costly, placing further financial stress on the already struggling Egyptian state. Crucially, the sheer presence of these migrating groups acted as a massive destabilizing force on the smaller coastal city-states like Ugarit and the principalities of Cyprus. These cities, already weakened by the collapse of the internal palace trade, found themselves caught between the immense demographic movement and the diminishing ability of the great empires Egypt and the Hittites to provide protection. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, already grappling with deep internal stress from resource shortages and possibly internal political conflict, seems to have dissolved quietly under this prolonged external and internal pressure. The massive Hittite capital of Hattusa was slowly abandoned, its complex administrative structure seizing up as the supply lines and agricultural predictability failed. This was not a sharp defeat, but a vast, slow dissolution, the ancient dust settling over the capital of a great power. The legacy of this quiet movement of peoples was the definitive breakup of the tightly knit, high-culture political system of the late Bronze Age. The disruption was a softening filter that wiped clean the slate of the centralized palace system, allowing for new, more localized, and less bureaucratic forms of governance to eventually emerge from the shadows of the abandoned Bronze Age empires. Chapter 7. Turning Points. The quiet dissolution of hierarchy. The immense demographic shifts and the dissolution of key political centers, most notably the Hittite capital of Hattusa, ushered in a new layer of turning points, the profound quiet breakdown of the internal hierarchy that had defined the Bronze Age. This was not the sharp collapse of a wall, but the slow unraveling of a complex, tightly wound thread. The palace economies, which relied on rigid social stratification, the king, the bureaucracy, the highly specialized artisans, and the laborers, could no longer sustain themselves due to the economic and agricultural stress. When the central authority could not deliver the predictable bronze and grain rations, the very structure of the society began to melt away. Imagine the specialized artisan, the bronze smith, who relied entirely on the palace for the rare tin required for his craft. When the palace could no longer provide the tin, the smith was forced to adapt. He no longer needed the centralized bureaucracy. He needed to find local alternative sources of metal or learn new crafts. This dispersal of specialized knowledge from the palace to the countryside was a crucial, softened historical shift. This decentralization was particularly visible in the Aegean world, where the great Mycenaean palaces were slowly abandoned. This was not a fierce uprising of the populace, but the quiet failure of the system to feed and equip itself. The scribes who meticulously kept the linear B tablets documenting the economy stopped writing. The administrative knowledge, the language of bureaucracy, simply faded from use. This cessation of writing was a profound, silent legacy, marking the loss of central control. The vacuum left by the collapse of the palaces was not immediately filled by new kingdoms. It led to a period of localized survival. The populace, freed from the rigid control of the centralized hierarchy, moved into smaller, self-sufficient, and often remote settlements. These communities relied on simpler, less specialized forms of agriculture and trade, focusing on regional resilience rather than global connectivity. This societal breakdown had an immense impact on the exchange network. The long-distance, high-status trade that defined the Bronze Age, the organized shipments of copper ingots and diplomatic gifts, simply ceased. The vast, organized flow was replaced by localized, small-scale maritime exchange and internal barter. The entire Mediterranean entered a period of economic silence, where the distant waves carried only the soft wind of smaller essential goods. The legacy of this quiet dissolution was the loss of literacy and centralized administration across much of the Aegean, leading to what later became known as the Greek Dark Age. However, we view this as a calm reinterpretation. It was a necessary period of simplification, a return to the ancient dust and the basics of local survival, allowing society to rebuild its foundations without the brittleness of the old, overly complex hierarchy. The low embers of culture were kept alive in these small remote settlements, waiting for the conditions to foster a new, more resilient formation. Chapter 8. Early Journeys. The Age of Local Survival. With the dissolution of the rigid palace hierarchies, the world entered a phase of decentralized early journeys, the age of local survival and adaptation. This period, often labeled the Dark Age by later scholars, was in fact a necessary time of simplification and resilience, spanning the decades following the abandonment of the great Mycenaean and Hittite centers. The vast majority of the population, having been quietly released from the bureaucratic control of the palace economies, did not embark on long disruptive migrations. Instead, they focused their efforts locally. This was an early journey characterized by retrenchment, a physical and social movement away from the large, brittle administrative centers and towards smaller, easily defensible, and more self-sufficient communities. Imagine the gentle footsteps of families moving inland away from the coastal routes that had become unpredictable. Due to the disruption of long-distance trade, they sought out remote valleys and high ground where they could rely solely on localized agriculture and resources. The core legacy of the Bronze Age. Its specialization was subtly replaced by versatility. The highly skilled artisans and scribes, no longer supported by palace rations, had to teach themselves and their communities generalized skills. The art of writing, specifically the cumbersome linear B script, was lost in the Aegean because it was purely a tool of palace administration, unnecessary for small-scale survival. The warm breath of high bureaucracy faded, replaced by oral traditions and local customs. The reliance on bronze diminished drastically because the complex trade network required to supply the rare tin had ceased to function. This forced a quiet but profound evolution in technology. Communities began to utilize the more locally available iron. Iron required different, less centralized methods of mining and smelting, making it a technology better suited to the new, decentralized economic reality. This slow, unhurried shift from bronze to iron was not a sudden invention, but a gradual, pragmatic, calm reinterpretation of metallurgy driven by scarcity. The maritime trade, which had sustained the interconnectedness of the Bronze Age, was reduced to short-distance coastal exchanges. Ships no longer ventured into the deep waters carrying massive state cargoes. Instead, localized exchanges occurred between neighboring islands and coastal settlements, ensuring the circulation of essential foodstuffs and basic materials. This was a soft wind of commerce, replacing the strong organized trade winds of the previous era. This period of local survival was not one of sharp suffering, but of continuous, quiet adaptation. Society became simpler, smaller, and more egalitarian. The immense social hierarchy of the palace system was replaced by the looser authority of local elders or small independent leaders. The legacy of this time was the forging of immense resilience. The communities that emerged from this period of isolation had learned to rely on themselves, setting the stage for the creation of new, more flexible political structures and the city-states that would eventually define the next great era of Mediterranean civilization. The low embers of culture were carefully tended through oral traditions, preserving the mythic memory of the great distant palaces that had once ruled the land. Chapter 9. Early Journeys. The Western Mediterranean Echoes. While the heartland of the Bronze Age, the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant underwent its period of quiet dissolution and local survival. The far western edges of the Mediterranean experienced their own unique early journeys of adaptation. These were distant echoes of the larger collapse, showing how the interconnectedness of the era subtly affected even the remote corners. In Italy, the Mycenaean influence had been significant, facilitating the trade of raw materials and finished goods. As the Mycenaean palaces quietly dissolved, this high-status trade abruptly ceased. However, the local Italian communities did not vanish. Instead, they began their own phase of retrenchment and local formation. Imagine the communities of southern Italy and Sicily. They had become accustomed to the smooth flow of organized trade. When the Mycenaean ships stopped arriving, these regions were forced into a quiet evolution, strengthening their own local networks and accelerating the adoption of iron technology. The interruption of the distant tin supply made the local availability of iron a crucial advantage, setting them on a path toward internal development that was simpler but more self-sufficient than the old Bronze Age model. Further west, the civilizations of the Atlantic fringe, such as those in Iberia and along the French coast, had been involved in the long, complex tin trade. They were at the very end of the supply chain. The Bronze Age collapse meant the demand for their tin, which once fueled the palaces of the Near East, vanished. This created an immediate, powerful stress on their specialized economies. Their subsequent early journeys were defined by adaptation. They redirected their vast resources, their mining and metallurgical skills, to serving local and regional markets, creating internal exchange systems that were less dependent on the unstable political centers of the East. This was a calm reinterpretation of their economic purpose, shifting from a global supplier to a regional producer. Crucially, the disruption also affected North Africa. The sea peoples, who we view as a gentle metaphor for large displaced populations, did not simply disappear after being repelled by the Egyptian pharaohs. Many of these groups settled along the Levantine and North African coasts. The most enduring example is the Pelasite Philistines, who quietly established settlements along the southern coast of the Levant, bringing with them unique cultural elements, new pottery styles, new burial customs, and a persistent memory of the sophisticated Aegean world from which they had been displaced. This settling was a softening filter on the chaos of migration. The arrival of these new groups catalyzed the formation of new, more flexible city-states in the Levant, replacing the old state-centric Canaanite kingdoms that had been weakened by the dissolution. The legacy of these western and southern early journeys was that the entire Mediterranean world entered a state of diffused potential. The center had crumbled, but the periphery, forced to innovate and adapt quietly, began to forge new, more resilient political and economic models. The age of large, brittle, interlocked empires was replaced by the low embers of decentralized, localized power, ready for the next great structural change. Chapter 10. Formation. The Phoenician and Philistine. Influences. The period of localized survival, characterized by small, self-sufficient communities, slowly gave way to a new phase of formation along the crucial coastal zones, particularly through the influence of the Phoenicians and the Philistines. These two groups emerging from the quiet diaspora following the collapse served as profound catalysts for the next great structural change. The Phoenicians, descendants of the old Canaanite maritime traders, concentrated their efforts in the cities of the Levant, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Unlike the great Bronze Age palaces, which controlled vast internal territories, the Phoenicians focused entirely on the sea. This was a new formation where resilience was built not on land management, but on maritime trade and adaptability. Imagine their ships venturing across the Mediterranean, with gentle footsteps carrying goods and culture to every corner of the sea. They specialized in high-value, small-volume goods, purple dye extracted from sea snails, finely worked metal, and Lebanese cedar wood. This trade was a quiet, continuous source of wealth that allowed their city-states to flourish in the fragmented world. The most significant legacy of the Phoenician formation was the alphabet. The Phoenicians needed a simple, efficient script for their far-flung commercial records, replacing the complex cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems of the Bronze Age palaces. Their solution, a phonetic alphabet, was a profound softening filter for literacy, making reading and writing accessible to merchants and sailors, not just palace scribes. This simplicity was the warm breath that would eventually flow westward, adapted by the Greeks and transforming communication forever. Meanwhile, the Philistines, a group associated with the Sea Peoples who had settled peacefully along the southern coast of the Levant, were forging their own unique formation. They established a loose confederation of 5 major city-states. The Philistine legacy lay in their mastery of the new metallurgy iron. While the Aegean world was struggling with the scarcity of tin, the Philistines were among the first in the region to fully and systematically exploit the more abundant local iron ore. This quiet technological advantage gave them a brief, significant economic and military edge. Their use of iron tools for farming and iron weapons provided stability and self-sufficiency in a world where bronze was a fading memory. This unhurried shift from bronze to iron was a final calm reinterpretation of technology, closing the door on the centralized Bronze Age demands. The formation of these two coastal powers, the Phoenicians with their alphabet and the Philistines with their iron, demonstrated that the future lay not with massive, brittle empires, but with specialized, highly adaptive, and decentralized city-states. The economic and cultural energy of the Eastern Mediterranean, though no longer centralized, was slowly consolidating around these new resilient coastal lantern glows. Chapter 11. Formation. The Hellenic Renaissance and the alphabet. The quiet influence of the Phoenician merchants carrying their goods, and more importantly, their simplified script across the Mediterranean, led to the next profound phase of formation and the Hellenic Renaissance, c.c. 800–750 BCE. This period saw the Greek world emerge from its localized survival mode by embracing and adapting this crucial legacy of the Phoenicians. The most transformative aspect of this formation was the adoption and adaptation of the Phoenician phonetic script. The Phoenician alphabet, which was simply a sequence of consonants, was a perfect softening filter for literacy. But the Greeks made a quiet, profound evolution. They added vowels. This simple addition of vowels transformed the script from a tool primarily for administrative and commercial record-keeping into a flexible instrument capable of accurately recording oral traditions and complex poetry. The widespread literacy that followed was a crucial force in the subsequent Greek explosion of philosophy, literature, and political thought. The warm breath of knowledge could now be widely shared, no longer confined to the low embers of an elite scribal class. The legacy of the Bronze Age collapse had been the loss of the centralized palace system. The new formation did not return to that brittle model. Instead, it was decentralized, built around the rise of the independent polis, the city-state. These polis, such as Athens and Corinth, developed their own unique political structures, relying on a shared language and a shared cultural memory of the distant echoes of the Mycenaean past, which was preserved and codified through the new alphabet. The early journeys of this era saw the re-establishment of formalized trade and sustained contact across the Aegean. The soft wind carried Greek ships now venturing further, establishing new trade routes and founding colonies across the Mediterranean from the Black Sea to southern Italy. This colonization was not an aggressive military expansion, but a methodical, gentle metaphor for population pressure and the search for new resources and stable trading partners. This colonization effort was critical to the growth of the polis. The colonies, while politically independent, remained culturally and commercially linked to their mother cities. They facilitated the systematic flow of grain, timber, and metals, creating a new, more decentralized and far more resilient trade network than the one that had sustained the centralized Bronze Age palaces. The formation of the polis, defined by public discussion, shared citizenship, though limited, and widespread literacy, was a direct outcome of the alphabet and the memory of the collapse. The Greeks sought a political system that was decentralized and adaptable, free from the inherent fragility of the old single point of failure palace economies. This Hellenic Renaissance was the true spiritual beginning of the classical world, a demonstration that the quiet, profound legacy of the collapse was not destruction, but the necessary clearing of the path for a new, more enduring formation. Chapter 12. Early Journeys, the Age of Colonization and the Wider World. The quiet, internal formation of the polis, powered by the new flexibility of the alphabet, soon led the Greeks to embark on expansive early journeys across the Mediterranean. 750–550 BCE. This was the age of colonization, a soft, methodical movement that extended the Hellenic world far beyond the Aegean and solidified a new resilient economic network. This movement was driven by the inherent constraints of the small rocky polis, a gentle metaphor for population pressure, and the search for reliable land and resources. Unlike the centralized imperial expansion of the Bronze Age palaces, this colonization was decentralized. Individual polis, like Corinth and Megara, sponsored expeditions not to conquer, but to found new independent cities, apoikiai. Imagine the small Greek ships venturing out across the distant waves with gentle footsteps, establishing new settlements in southern Italy, known as Magna Graecia, Sicily, the coasts of the Black Sea in North Africa. These colonies were established in areas rich in grain, timber, or metals which were desperately needed back in the Aegean homeland. The colonies served a crucial function in the new economic structure. They were the key mechanism for trade recovery, replacing the old, brittle Bronze Age dependency on high-status palace-to-palace exchange. The colonies created a system of predictable, high-volume exchange. The colonies supplied grain and raw materials, while the mother cities supplied manufactured goods, particularly sophisticated pottery, and finished metalware. This immense maritime movement created a vast softening filter for cultural exchange across the Mediterranean. The Greeks, coming into continuous contact with the indigenous populations of Italy, Sicily, and the Black Sea region, absorbed new technologies and ideas, while simultaneously spreading their language, political structure, and artistic forms. This was a calm reinterpretation of cultural interaction built on mutual economic benefit, rather than rigid imperial decree. Crucially, this period saw the quiet rise of coinage as a standardized medium of exchange. Developed initially in Lydia in Anatolia, The idea of using small stamped pieces of electrum or silver for standardized transactions rapidly flowed westward along the newly established trade routes. This evolution further facilitated trade, allowing merchants to transact business without relying on the cumbersome barter systems of the past. Coinage represented a new level of economic sophistication and trust, making the soft wind of commerce flow more freely. The legacy of this age of colonization was twofold. Internally, the economic prosperity and increased trade wealth fueled political change within the original poleis, leading to the quiet overthrow of local aristocracies and the rise of tyrants who were often popular champions of the newly wealthy merchant class. Externally, the colonization solidified the Greek cultural presence, setting the stage for the classical world and ensuring that the polis, the resilient political invention born from the ashes of the collapse, would become the enduring political structure of the region. The vast Mediterranean was no longer fragmented. It was beginning to hum with the quiet, decentralized energy of the Hellenic trade. Chapter 13: Early Journeys. The quiet rise of tyrants and the Lydian gold. The decentralized wealth generated by the age of colonization and the maritime trade routes led to the next subtle phase of early journeys within the Greek poleis, the quiet rise of the tyrants, AE, 650–500 BCE. This shift was a political evolution driven entirely by economic forces and the need for new internal stability. A tyrant, in this ancient context, did not necessarily denote a cruel or oppressive ruler. It referred to an individual who seized power unconstitutionally, often with the backing of the newly wealthy merchant class and the disadvantaged populace. This was a softening filter for internal political stress. The tyrants emerged to break the rigid, unyielding power of the old land-owning aristocracy, whose legal frameworks were no longer sufficient to manage the complex trade-based economies. Imagine this political shift as a slow tide of discontent among the non-aristocratic citizens, artisans, merchants, and farmers burdened by debt, who saw the tyrants as champions of the new economic reality. The tyrants often initiated vast public works, sponsored arts and festivals, and crucially enacted legislation that favored trade and wealth redistribution. This created immense stability and prosperity within their cities, strengthening the local police despite the unconstitutional nature of their rule. Simultaneously, the economic network of the Aegean received a profound cultural and technological injection from the east, centered around the kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. The Lydian legacy was the standardization of coined money. While the idea of using metal for exchange had existed, the Lydians were the first to systematically produce and guarantee small, precisely weighed pieces of electrum, a natural gold and silver alloy, stamped with an official symbol. This invention was a profound turning point, a quiet, unexciting administrative solution that revolutionized trade. The legacy of Lydian coinage flowed quickly along the newly established Greek trade routes. Coins replaced the cumbersome system of barter and made commercial transactions faster, more reliable, and universally recognized. This quiet technological transfer was the warm breath that fueled the expansion of the polis and the consolidation of mercantile wealth. The most famous Lydian ruler, King Croesus, became a gentle metaphor for immense, almost mythic wealth. His kingdom, founded on the flow of gold and the standardization of coinage, was the primary economic partner for the Greek cities across the Aegean. The early journeys of the Greek tyrants were often aimed at securing diplomatic and commercial ties with these powerful eastern kingdoms, ensuring a continuous supply of precious metals and opening new markets for manufactured goods. This period was characterized by immense quiet prosperity, where the political structure evolved to meet the demands of a complex trade-driven economy. The age of the tyrants, though challenging the old aristocratic order, was a necessary political formation. It provided the internal peace and economic stability needed for the individual polis to flourish, setting the stage for the dramatic philosophical and political shifts that would define the classical age. Chapter 14, Turning Points. The Persian Threat and the Softening of Ideals. The immense prosperity generated by colonization and the stability provided by the tyrants brought the Greek world to its first major external turning point, the pressure exerted by the colossal Achaemenid Persian Empire, ESC, 550-479 BCE. This encounter was not a mere political skirmish. It was a fundamental challenge to the Greek polis and its decentralized way of life, forcing a profound, quiet evolution of Greek identity. The origins of this turning point lay in the expansion of the Persian Empire, which under kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius systematically absorbed the Greek city-states located on the western coast of Anatolia, Ionia. The Ionian Greeks, feeling the immense centralized pressure of the Persian administration, briefly engaged in a resistance movement known as the Ionian Revolt CEC. 499-494 BC. We view this revolt not as a sharp military conflict, but as a distant echo of resistance against the loss of the hard-won autonomy of the polis. The Persian response was predictable, a methodical, deliberate effort to bring the rebellious Greek cities back under the umbrella of their vast imperial order. The central conflict unfolded in a series of organized, large-scale campaigns known as the Persian Wars Annuai, 490-479 BCE. The Persian army, moving with the immense slow logistical power of a unified empire, sought to impose its will on the independent polis of mainland Greece. This challenge, though immense, acted as a crucial softening filter on the internal divisions within Greece. The various polis, often rivals, were forced into an unprecedented act of cooperation. This temporary, uneasy alliance between traditional rivals like Athens, a nascent democracy, and Sparta, a rigid oligarchy, was a profound, calm reinterpretation of political identity, where the shared idea of Hellenism superseded local conflicts. The key engagements, such as the quiet tactical victory at Marathon and the methodical calculated naval engagements at Salamis and Mycenaean, were fought not merely for territory, but for the principle of decentralized freedom. The Greek victories confirmed in the quietest way possible that the resilient, adaptable structure of the polis, fueled by citizen participation and the wealth generated by colonization, could withstand the immense centralized power of the ancient Eastern empires. The legacy of the Persian Wars was not just military, it was spiritual and political. The victory fostered an immense sense of confidence and validated the political and social formation of the polis. It ushered in the classical age, c. 479-323 BCE, a period of unparalleled flourishing in art philosophy and political experimentation centered on Athens. The warm breath of newfound freedom and cultural confidence solidified the Greek worldview, leading to the creation of institutions and ideas such as democracy and classical philosophy that would become the enduring foundation of Western thought. The ancient dust of the Persian campaigns settled, leaving behind a world where the resilient polis stood unchallenged. Chapter 15, Turning Points. The Athenian Ascendancy and the Rivalry. The quiet triumph over the Persian Empire was the definitive turning point that launched the classical age ECC, 479-404 BCE. But this freedom quickly led to a profound internal evolution within Greece, the rise of Athenian ascendancy and the inevitable rivalry with Sparta. The Persian Wars had necessitated the formation of a defensive alliance, the Delian League, led by Athens. We view this league not as a military formation, but as a gentle metaphor for economic and political consolidation. Athens, with its immense naval power and strategic harbor at Piraeus, gradually transformed the league from a voluntary alliance into an Athenian-controlled empire. The dues, originally intended for defense, became a steady, predictable flow of silver and resources into the Athenian treasury. This immense wealth fueled the golden age of Athens. The city embarked on massive public works, most famously constructing the Parthenon on the Acropolis. These architectural projects were not built under stress or threat. but were a calm reinterpretation of national confidence, showcasing the city's democratic ideals and its artistic and philosophical dominance. The warm breath of creativity settled over the city, giving rise to figures like Socrates and the great tragedians. However, this quiet ascendancy caused immense tension with Sparta, the traditional and rigid military power of the Peloponnese. Sparta leading its own land-based alliance, the Peloponnesian League viewed Athens' naval empire, its democratic evolution, and its use of the League's treasury as a fundamental violation of the principles of decentralized Greek autonomy. The ensuing Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BCE, was the most significant yet filtered turning point in Greek history. We narrate this conflict not as a sharp military tragedy, but as a long drawn-out softened historical shift, a failure of diplomacy and political understanding between two fundamentally different poleis. The war was a strategic deadlock. Athens was unassailable by land due to its long walls connecting it to the sea, and Sparta was unassailable by sea due to its lack of a navy. The war dissolved into a series of localized skirmishes, sieges, and a destructive plague in Athens, which we view as a misty recollection of demographic decline, all of which drained the wealth and the morale of the entire Hellenic world. The conflict was essentially a distant echo of the political stress caused by the uneven distribution of power and resources following the Persian victory. The ultimate Spartan victory achieved with financial aid from the Persians, the very enemy the Greeks had defeated, was a quiet transition back to regional autonomy. Athens' empire was dismantled, its long walls torn down, and its democratic system briefly replaced by an oligarchy. The legacy of this long conflict was the irreparable weakening of the polis system as the primary source of Greek stability. The war consumed the resources and the political will of the leading cities, opening the way for new external powers to influence Greek affairs. The low embers of self-governance were scattered, ensuring that the next great power to rise would not be from within the fragile polis system, but from the periphery. Chapter 16. Turning Points. The rise of Macedon and the end of the polis. The long-draining internal political conflict of the Peloponnesian War left the Greek world profoundly weakened. This paved the way for the next inevitable turning point in the rise of the Kingdom of Macedon, located on the northern periphery of the Hellenic world. This shift was a quiet, profound, softened historical shift that ended the sovereignty of the independent polis. Macedon, traditionally viewed by the southern Greeks as less civilized, was a land of immense resources, particularly timber and gold, and possessed a highly effective centralized monarchy. The first great figure of this ascent was Philip II, reigned 359–336 BCE. Philip II's rise was a methodical evolution of military technology and diplomacy. He did not achieve dominance through sudden, sharp invasions, but through the patient strategic application of force and financial maneuvering. His primary military innovation was the Macedonian phalanx, a highly disciplined infantry formation armed with the sarissa, an exceptionally long pike. This formation created an organized, stable shield wall that was technically superior to the traditional, shorter hoplite formations of the southern polis. Philip's political strategy was a masterpiece of quiet transitions. He used Macedonian gold, often sourced from their abundant mines, to bribe or buy influence among the perpetually feuding Greek city-states. He offered stability and wealth, capitalizing on the exhaustion left by the long wars. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as the hegemon leader capable of unifying the Greeks for a common purpose. The quiet dream of an invasion of the weakened Persian Empire. The final decisive turning point came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. We narrate this event as a distant echo of strategic finality. Here, Philip's unified Macedonian army and its superior tactics overcame the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. This was not the destruction of the polis, but its quiet formal submission to a single external political authority. Philip did not dismantle the polis. He respected their legal structures and cultural autonomy, but their foreign policy and military independence were permanently absorbed under Macedonian control. He organized the Greek states into the League of Corinth, a political alliance under Macedonian leadership, ensuring that Greek military power was now centrally directed. Philip's sudden death left the immense task of realizing the invasion of Persia to his young son, Alexander III, Alexander the Great. The legacy of Philip II was the irreversible end of the age of the sovereign independent polis. The inherent fragility of the decentralized system exposed during the Peloponnesian War had finally yielded to the superior stability and resources of the centralized monarchy. The low embers of democratic experimentation continued to glow, but the soft wind of political power now blew from the north, setting the stage for the next immense early journey into the east. Chapter 17. Early Journeys, Alexander's Unification and the Hellenistic Flood. The methodical consolidation achieved by Philip II set the stage for the most spectacular of all early journeys in the ancient world. The immense campaign of Alexander the Great reigned 336–323 BC. This journey was the single force that irrevocably ended the fragmented geopolitical reality of the Bronze and Classical Ages, creating a unified Hellenic world that stretched from Greece to India. Alexander's journey began as the long-planned campaign against the Persian Empire, the ancient enemy of the Greeks. We view this colossal movement not as a sustained military struggle, but as a rapid, unhurried flow of cultural and political energy across vast geographical expanses. The Macedonian phalanx, the organized army inherited from his father, moved with an efficiency that quickly dissolved the massive decentralized structure of the Persian domain. The true legacy of Alexander's journey was not the destruction of kingdoms, but the founding of new cities and the softening filter of cultural exchange. Alexander founded dozens of cities across the east, naming many of them Alexandria. These cities were designed as centers for Greek culture, language, and trade, establishing a common economic and intellectual framework that spanned 3 continents. Imagine the gentle footsteps of the Greek administrators, scholars, merchants, and artists who followed the army. They settled in these new urban centers, establishing polis, city-states with familiar institutions, gymnasia, theaters, and libraries, in lands that had traditionally been governed by entirely different structures. This was a profound, calm reinterpretation of civilization, where Greek ideas blended and synthesized with the ancient cultures of Egypt, Persia, and India. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator from the Persians and was swiftly recognized as a new pharaoh, demonstrating the enduring power of the Egyptian political formation. He founded the most important of his new cities, Alexandria, which quickly became the greatest center of Hellenistic trade and scholarship. This was a profound turning point for global intellectual life. The entire Hellenistic world, created by Alexander's single relentless journey, became a vast interconnected sphere. Trade flourished more smoothly than it had since the Bronze Age, as a single cultural language, Koine Greek, and a stable currency facilitated easy commerce across the former Persian territories. The warm breath of Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science now flowed eastward, while the knowledge and wisdom of the East flowed westward, creating a vibrant, unified intellectual environment. Alexander's sudden death in Babylon left an immense power vacuum. However, the immense legacy of his journey held firm. The empire fractured not into its original disparate kingdoms, but into a series of large, powerful Hellenistic successor kingdoms, the Diadochi, such as the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Persia, and the Antigonids in Macedon. These successor kingdoms, despite their political distant echoes of conflict, all maintained the Greek political and cultural framework, ensuring that the vast cultural fusion achieved by Alexander's journey continued for centuries. The low embers of Greek civilization had been spread far and wide, ensuring its endurance as a global force. Chapter 18. Legacy. The deep roots of the Hellenistic world. Alexander's immense early journey had concluded, and the legacy of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms became the final sprawling testament to the interconnectedness of the ancient world. This period was not one of sharp collapse, but of a deep, sustained cultural mixing, a quiet, continuous flow of ideas, art, and commerce across the vast territories stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. The legacy of the Hellenistic age was rooted in its cities. The polis structure, the resilient political invention born from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, was transplanted across the Middle East. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Seleucia in Mesopotamia became magnificent centers of trade and intellectual life. They were true melting pots where the warm breath of Greek language and philosophy mingled with the deep, ancient dust of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Persian traditions. Imagine the Library of Alexandria, the symbolic heart of this intellectual synthesis. It was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, drawing scholars who preserved translated and synthesized texts from every known civilization. This was a methodical, unhurried process that ensured the accumulated wisdom of the ancient Near East flowed directly into the emerging Western tradition. The Hellenistic scholars made profound, quiet advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, building directly on the legacies of Babylon and Egypt. The economic legacy was equally profound. The successor kingdoms managed to create a smooth, large-scale trade network. Maritime routes were meticulously charted and secured, facilitating the slow tides of commerce between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and India. The use of standardized Greek currency and the Koine Greek language as the universal lingua franca minimized the friction of exchange, leading to unprecedented prosperity and cultural movement. This period was a softening filter for religion. New syncretic cults emerged, blending Greek deities with Egyptian or Persian gods, like the cult of Serapis. More importantly, it was during this time that Judaism interacted profoundly with Greek philosophy, and the groundwork was unknowingly laid for the spread of early Christianity, which would utilize the established Koine Greek language and the safe Roman road networks built later. The legacy of the Hellenistic kingdoms proved that the core idea of Greek civilization, its philosophy, its language, and its urban structure, was immensely adaptable. The kingdoms maintained a soft reflection of the old polis freedom, but within the context of large centralized monarchies. This system remained the geopolitical reality for nearly 3 centuries, demonstrating the profound endurance of Alexander's vast, unifying early journey. The Hellenistic world was the final shimmering stage set for the last great external force to rise in the West. A force that would ultimately absorb this entire cultural sphere, not through destruction, but through slow, methodical integration. Chapter 19. Turning Points. The Roman Shadow and the Enduring Legacy. The immense cultural and economic sphere of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms, though stable internally, was slowly approaching its final, inevitable turning point, the methodical absorption by the rising power of Rome. This was the slow, quiet imposition of a new political master over the ancient lands of the Mediterranean, a process that lasted over 2 centuries. Rome's expansion eastward was not a single sharp invasion, but a strategic and legalistic process. They first intervened in the affairs of the Hellenistic kingdoms as liberators, or allies, subtly weakening them through treaties, financial demands, and carefully applied diplomatic pressure. This initial phase was a softening filter, allowing Rome to integrate the region without massive continuous military expenditure. The key moment came with the gradual dissolution of the Seleucid Empire, the largest successor state, and the eventual political decline of the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. Rome capitalized on internal conflicts and succession crises within these kingdoms, using the distant echoes of political competition to assert its own stabilizing presence. The true legacy of the Hellenistic age was its wealth, its strategic location, and its advanced administration. Rome recognized the immense value of inheriting these established functioning systems. They did not destroy the great Hellenistic cities like Alexandria and Antioch. Rather, they used them as administrative and trade hubs for their own burgeoning empire. The turning point was complete when Rome directly annexed the last major Hellenistic state, Egypt, following the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony in 30 BCE. This event, narrated previously in a different context, marked the end of the line of Macedonian kings who had ruled the eastern Mediterranean since Alexander. The low embers of Greek political sovereignty were extinguished, but the cultural warm breath flowed directly into the Roman system. Under Roman rule, the established Silk Road trade routes and the maritime networks continued to flow often more smoothly than before, protected by the gentle footsteps of Roman legions and the uniform application of Roman law. Roman engineers simply overlaid their practical solutions, roads, aqueducts, and administrative systems onto the advanced Greek urban structures. The profound legacy of the Hellenistic synthesis was thus preserved and transmitted through Roman governance. The Greek language koine remained the language of commerce, philosophy, and learning in the entire eastern half of the Roman Empire, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of the classical and Hellenistic worlds were not lost. This final turning point demonstrated that the ultimate fate of the interconnected world forged by the Bronze Age collapse and Alexander's conquest was integration. The entire region from the Aegean to the Nile became part of a single vast political entity, ready for the next final phase of its long, quiet cultural legacy. Chapter 20. Legacy, the long echoes of the Bronze Age collapse. We arrive at the final chapter of our long, slow journey across the immense fractured world of the Bronze Age. The political structures, the great palaces and empires have faded, absorbed into the Roman system, or transformed into new entities. This final phase focuses on the enduring legacy of the collapse, tracing the profound, quiet echoes that shaped the world we know today. The most vital legacy of the Bronze Age collapse was the destruction of the brittle centralized system and the birth of resilience. The collapse forced a complete restart, moving from a system dependent on long-distance, high-status trade bronze and palace luxury to a decentralized system based on local resources and self-sufficiency. This simplification was the softening filter that allowed later civilizations to flourish. The legacy is manifest in the technological shift, the final, unhurried adoption of iron. Because iron ore was more widely available than tin, its use freed civilization from the immense fragile supply chains that had defined the Bronze Age. Iron tools and weapons could be produced locally, cheaply, and reliably, promoting agricultural stability and defensive autonomy across smaller regions. This quiet technological evolution was the foundation of the success of the Greek polis and the emerging kingdoms of the Levant. The political legacy was the birth of the city-state. The old hierarchical palace system was replaced by the decentralized, more flexible polis in Greece, and the Phoenician, Philistine maritime city-states in the Levant. These new political formations, characterized by citizen participation, or in the case of the Phoenicians, commercial focus and widespread literacy, thanks to the borrowed alphabet, proved far more resilient and adaptable than the top-down specialized monarchies of the past. The low embers of self-governance were scattered, ready to ignite into the diverse political experimentation of the classical world. The greatest intellectual legacy was the creation of the alphabet. The collapse forced a communicative reset. The cumbersome administrative scripts of the Bronze Age, like Linear B and Akkadian cuneiform, were abandoned, and the simplified phonetic Phoenician alphabet was adopted and perfected by the Greeks. This was the most profound, softened historical shift. It democratized literacy, making writing accessible to the merchant, the philosopher, and the ordinary citizen. This widespread literacy was the essential catalyst for the subsequent flourishing of Greek philosophy, history, and literature. The legacy of the collapse, therefore, was not chaos, but the necessary clearing of the slate. The vast, interconnected world built on fragile threads of bronze and tin had to fracture so that a new, stronger world built on the decentralized availability of iron and the pervasive efficiency of the alphabet could emerge. The long, deep sleep of the Bronze Age was followed by a more robust, decentralized awakening. The story is complete. The immense ancient cycle has concluded. The soft wind carries the distant echoes of the palaces, but the warm breath of the alphabet and the quiet stone of the Iron Age police remain. In this quiet journey tonight, we drifted through the gentle echoes of the Bronze Age collapse. We moved from the golden threads of its high connectivity and the immense centralized formation of its palaces through the turning points of resource scarcity and population movement to the profound legacy of the alphabet and the rise of decentralized resilience. We followed the rhythms of the Mediterranean from its earliest beginnings to the soft traces they leave behind in the foundations of our world. The story of the Bronze Age reminds us that the greatest strength is not always found in complexity or immense centralization, but in simplicity and adaptability. When the systems we build become too brittle, nature and human resilience compel us to return to the basics, forging new paths from the simplest materials available. If this peaceful journey brought you ease, you may leave a soft like or whisper in the comments where you'd like to drift next. And now, let the night grow still. Let your breath slow. May sleep come softly and carry you into peaceful rest. Good night.